But first, I'd like to welcome you all to the U.S. Foreign Policy Seminar at the Institute of International Studies. The Institute would like me to sort of announce at the very beginning that video of today's session will be available on the Institute's website within a week or so. So for those who are at the very back of the room or unable to enter the room, you will be able to see today's presentation via the Institute's website. Thank you all for coming to today's session. I'm aware that you're all here amid some very compelling political distractions. The Indiana primary is unfolding. The Faculty Senate is today meeting. Today, the Republican primary and the Democratic primary may be adjudicated. The Senate may engage in some polite discussion of the administration's record. It is sort of tempting at some level to use this coincidence of political developments to draw a contrast between an American style of politics and a Chinese style of politics, but to do so would be inappropriate. So I will refrain from such comparison and instead simply introduce our guest, Professor Odd Arne Westat of the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Westat, who is at Harvard the S.T. Lee Professor of U.S.-Asia Relations. This is a relatively recent appointment for Professor Westat, who until 2015 taught at the London School of Economics, where he was Professor of International History. Professor Westat is the author of numerous books and almost innumerable articles and edited volumes on the international history of the 20th century and the history of the Cold War. I'm not going to list his entire bibliography because to do so would take far longer than would be appropriate for an introduction, but I would like to flag for you some of his more recent publications. Anybody who has taken any of my classes will likely have read The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions and the Making of Our Times, a tremendously successful book. In fact, tremendously successful understates the magnitude of this book's significance. This book, which Professor Westat published in 2005, won the Bancroft Prize, by far the most storied prize in the entire field of U.S. history. It's a magnificent accomplishment and a book that has been tremendously influential on the field of Cold War studies, on the field of U.S. Foreign relations history, on the field of international history more broadly. Professor Westat is also a co-editor with Mel Leffler of the Cambridge History of the Cold War, a landmark series published by Cambridge University Press. And Professor Westat's editorship of this series really affirms sort of his position as his generation's preeminent historian of the Cold War, a description that few, if any, would take issue with. Besides being a preeminent historian of the Cold War, Professor Westat is also a leading historian of international relations in the East Asian milieu. His first book, which evolved out of his doctoral dissertation at the University of North Carolina, explored the origins of the Cold War in East Asia. And Professor Westat has returned recurrently to East Asia as a topical focus for his research. Indeed, his most recent book, Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750, represented a return to the East Asian milieu. The book was published in 2012 to a slew of superlative reviews, and we're very fortunate to be able to hear more this afternoon about China's foreign relations and the implications for the United States and U.S. foreign policy. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Westat back to Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Professor Westat. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much. Well, it is great to be back at Berkeley. I want to thank the university here. I want to thank its history department. I want to thank the Institute for International Studies, and not least my friend Daniel Sargent, both for his very, very generous introduction, but also for helping to set up the visit here to the university. It's really good to be back. I mean, I talked, I think, briefly about this book when I was here last time, or on one of my last visits, but it was before the book was actually published. So people at Berkeley have had some input on this one already, and now you will have a chance to critique it, or at least critique what I have to say today. It's true what Daniel said, that much of my work has been on international affairs in the 20th century in a sort of broader sense. But I have come back on quite a number of occasions to work on what is my own real speciality, which is the international history of Eastern Asia, and particularly of China. And what I wanted to do in this particular book, the 2012 Restless Empire, is to see if I could take a great chunk of time, really 250 years of China's international affairs, and try to write a book that would be useful both for a Chinese and for a non-Chinese audience on these kinds of things. So it's quite obvious that when you write a book of that sort, it has to be a book that deals with the past in very broad strokes, right? Because if not, you won't get anything done, or everyone from your wife to your publisher will start saying, "Where is that book? You know, isn't it coming out at some point soon?" So I had to make this into an exercise in limitation in overall terms. But that's good. That's helpful. I was talking to some of the grad students here over lunch today, and one of the things that does stand out, I mean, not just to historians, but to historians most of all, is that sometimes you have to be brief to be efficient in terms of the argument that you want to put forward. And doing broader studies like this one is a good way of getting to that, to the delights of brevity. But also other reasons why I wanted to write this particular book at the point when I did it. The first one is a need which I think is urgent for creating a more China-centered history of China, and particularly of China's international affairs. A lot of what has been written in the past, some of it is very good and very useful, has still been written primarily from non-Chinese sources, and most of them are Western sources, European or North American. And I wanted to move away from that. In this book, very clearly, very deliberately, I did not want to see China in light of what had happened elsewhere, but first and foremost in terms of what was going on within China itself. So when I say that this is an international history of China, I really mean that. It is an international history of China, in which China's own position and the discussions that have taken place within China, whatever way you define China, I'll get to that in a moment, those are the ones that are accentuated. Those are the ones that are underlined. And it's possible to do that today. I mean, different from, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you can actually do a China-centered history of China. And the reason for that is that so much more has become available in terms of historical sources from a variety of archives and collections within China itself. And when I say China, I mean what is today the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and also from the Chinese diaspora. As you will see later on in this talk, the Chinese diaspora plays a very important role in this book. So you can do it now. Now, a lot of historians inside China and outside are complaining about how the regime tries to restrict access to historical sources, and that criticism would be entirely right. And under Xi Jinping's leadership, things have become more difficult. There's no doubt about that, in terms of accessing source materials especially in official archives, but also elsewhere. The party's self-definition includes a stewardship of the past, and therefore one has to regulate access to materials. But even so, and even today, there is a vast amount of materials that can be accessed that would not have been available only a few years ago. So even though it's right to criticize the lack of access that is there now, it is far, far superior to what has been the case in the past. And it made it possible for me to write this book. Without it, I couldn't have done it. Now, as I indicated already, when you write about a subject the size of China, and particularly China over a very long period of time, there are certain issues of definitions that are problematic. And if I were to forget those, my students would certainly remind me of them. The need to have your definitions clear in terms of what you want to do. So you have to open a writing about this kind of topic with the very broad question, what is China? And that is not as simple and straightforward as it might seem. There is one clear reason for that. China is very big and has always been very big, has always had a very large population, right? And easy issues of definition are not done, shouldn't be done, shouldn't even be attempted, I think, when you're dealing with countries that are very large. The United States of America is similar in many ways in terms of definition. It's difficult to define what America is. It's even difficult sometimes, particularly for foreigners, to define where America ends. Some of that is equally difficult for Chinese and have been so, I contend in this book, over a very long period of time. So in terms of definition, here is my definition for what it's worth. China is a culture, first and foremost, a state, and a geographical core around which identities and boundaries and definitions of purpose have shifted and adjusted for a very, very long time. I think the short version of that is that China is very much about change. It's about a great deal of change over time. That's a central theme to this book. So I could as well give that part away for those of you who haven't read it. Forget the idea of the unchangeable, static China. You won't find it in this book. China is about embracing change and doing so more than most other great cultures that I know of. Now, the other question that my students ask, again, very fairly, because this is something I really push them on. So they would say, so Professor Westad, what are your interpretations? What are your main conclusions in this book? And that's where I get into real trouble, because if you write a history of the international affairs of the biggest country on earth, in terms of population, over 250 years, it's very hard to do a small number of key interpretations, right? There are many of them. You'll find them on almost every page, because I deal with different kinds of stuff throughout all of this. So, although there are, of course, interpretations, there are key analysis in the book, they, in my view, are not the most important aspect of the book in terms of understanding it, or understanding what I have to say today. There might not be any clear overarching analysis in the book, but there are what you could call studies of concepts and perceptions that change over time, sometimes change very dramatically, but at the core, there are a few central preoccupations, let's call them that, for lack of a better word, that are carried over from China's deeper history. So before my 250-year history begin, there are certain central preoccupations that, in my view, throwing accusations of essentialism to the winds, that have been with most people who have defined themselves as Chinese for a very, very long time. Of course, there are many more than the three that I'm going to focus on, but let me just do these three, also for the sake of discussion, because I'm sure there are people here who would have their own views on this. So three central preoccupations that I find in Chinese politics over the past maybe 2,000 years or so, back to the Han, the height of the Han dynasty. The first one is what you could call a concept of justice. A concept of justice. Now, this is not justice in the way that is generally interpreted in the Western tradition. And it's certainly not about redistributive justice, the way that is often discussed at the forefront of our debates here and in Europe today. This is rather about justice in the form of things having their natural place within a certain given universe. Justice in a directional or relative form, to use the positional form, to use the philosophical terms for this. Sometimes this form of justice that Chinese have been preoccupied with, especially, but not exclusively in the Confucian and Neo-Confucian traditions, could be seen as hierarchical. So the sense that things have their place in the state, in the family, in the universe, is something that has to do with relative position, up and down. But that, one has to be careful with that, because that's not the full aspect of the Chinese concepts of justice. Think, for those of you who have Chinese here, on the concept E, the concept of how you place things relatively to each other, the rightful order, whatever you want to translate it. Some of these concepts are very hard to translate. But out of this comes a discourse about China's place in the world. And that's something that is really, really important for me in doing this book. Out of these preoccupations with justice, whatever way you want to define it, comes the understanding that China has been treated very unjustly, very unfairly, over most of the time period that I'm preoccupied with in the book. That what has happened to China, the relative reduction in China's role, first and foremost regionally, but also internationally, is something that is unjust. And you can see this in terms of how many Chinese tried to understand, including many Chinese actually here at Berkeley in the early part of the 20th century, tried to make sense of how these new concepts of justice that were introduced from the outside world actually worked. And many of them, of course, drew the conclusion after a few years that they didn't work at all. That the world that they had been forced into was not based on justice, it was chaotic, and it was predatory. And some Chinese took that over, and others resented it up to today. There's a lively debate on these kinds of things. So secondly, so the first one is concept of justice. The second one is what you could call a preoccupation with rules and rituals. And again, one has to be very careful with this. This is not rituals as the ritual kowtowing to the emperor, which existed more in the Western mind than what it ever did in the Chinese. Particularly when you deal with an emperor like the great Qianlong emperor, who is in charge when my story starts. He had 150 different ways in which he could treat foreign delegations, also in terms of the so-called kowtowing. It depended on who you were, and it depended on what kind of views he had for you. This is politics. It's not about setting things in stone. So we have to move from that narrow concept of rules and rituals over to one that is much more flexible and has to do with a preoccupation in a sort of systemic sense about things having their rightful place and how to understand the way to treat others and how to be treated within the state and within international society. And to really grasp that. And in the period that I'm talking about here, sort of up to the latter part of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, this was also a key debate among many Chinese. So one of the first subjects that were taught in kind of mixed higher education institutions that started to be set up in China in the 1870s had to do with international law. And why was international law so important? Well, the assumption from the Chinese side was that this was a way of grasping the rules and rituals according to which the outside world that China had now stepped into worked. I mean, what was the framework for it? One of the first people, by the way, to teach international law in China was John Fryer, who later became the first professor of Chinese here at Berkeley, and who'd been working on this and other issues as an intermediary in China, originally English from Norfolk. He'd been working on it for a long time. But of course, a little bit as with the concepts of justice, many Chinese, I think, in the late 19th century, found that they had put all of this effort into understanding how Western-style international law worked, just in order to discover that the main Western powers had no intention of ever living up to these ideals of how their concept for international law actually worked, right? But there are still echoes of this today. Look at China's preoccupation with the UN and particularly with the Security Council. Very much connected, in my view, to this search for rules, a search for an order to which China can link its own policies. And then finally, there is what could be called a sense of centrality. And again, you have to be very careful with this. I mean, I discover sometimes, particularly here in the United States, people who regard the Chinese name for China, Zhongguo, as a kind of slogan. So that means this middle kingdom or the central kingdom, right? So that is a claim to Chinese universal centrality. Wrong. It's a name. It's a name for a country, right? Just like other countries have names that are more or less meaningful. America, for instance. It's a name with a historical trajectory. For those of you who are interested in political etymology, comes out of a period when China was split into several state entities, and those that happened geographically to be in the middle came out and had the upper hand. That's the origin of the name Zhongguo. So that's not what this is about. Centrality is, to me, relentlessly cultural. It is about most Chinese, most all Chinese that I know, whatever generation they are of, being critically aware that they are the originators, their people are the originators of a common culture that spread gradually throughout most of Eastern Asia. They are the root of that culture, the origin of it, the bun, the stem, the root, where it actually comes from, right? And therefore, in a sense, China should be respected for that cultural contribution. That's about as far as the claim of centrality goes. But that's a lot, of course, if you think about it within a cultural setting, right? And a cultural international affairs setting. It does put you at the center, and it makes it possible for you to ask some hard questions about others, be they Japanese or Koreans or Vietnamese or whatever, who have their own relationship to that great tradition. I have a strong suspicion that in the younger generation in China today, particularly within the People's Republic of China, this particular sense of centrality is more important than it's been for a very, very long time. And just to give away where I would be moving on this, Daniel, it creates no end of trouble in terms of its present form. So that's where we are on preoccupations. They are not. None of this is written in stone. So those who think that you can go back to Master Kong, to Kong Fuzi, and you can read this and you can say, aha, that's how Xi Jinping thinks. That doesn't work. Just like you can't go back and read Aristotle or Plato in order to understand how people think, politicians think in the West today. Didn't just say that with the current election campaign in this country in mind, Daniel, but so that's not the point. This is not about things that are set, definite, unchangeable. It is about preoccupations. It's about issues that people are preoccupied with, and then they find in each new generation they find slightly different answers to them. That's not just unique for China. It's it happens everywhere, but because China is a very, very big country, it probably happens there more than most. Let me talk a little bit about how I tried to put this book together. Now, as you may have guessed already, this is not just a book about foreign relations in the narrow sense. This is not even mainly about, diplomacy and wars and that sort of international affairs. It's much more about immigrants and emigrants. It's about businessmen. It's about missionaries. It's about these intermediaries who I already mentioned, John Fryer, who was, I think, definition-wise, very much in between being a foreigner and being a Chinese in China, for reasons I mentioned in a second. It's people like Ruang Hong, who is one of my favorites, known in the United States as Jung Wing, the first Chinese who graduated from American college, from Yale College in 1854. It's about these kinds of people who are sometimes quite uncomfortably caught in the middle between different states and also between different cultures. But let me pause just before I go on, actually, using John Fryer as an example. Very strange, by the way, there is no full-scale biography of John Fryer. Someone at Berkeley, where his papers are, should make use of the opportunity to do that. So, in 19th century China, in most places, and well into this past century, the 20th century, the definition of being Chinese was also first and foremost a cultural one. Because Chinese came in all kinds of sizes and shapes, the key was, because China was an empire, the key was the written culture, so the written language. And whoever managed written Chinese were inside. And those who didn't were on the outside. So someone like John Fryer would have been recognized by many people as being on the inside. Maybe not fully Chinese, but certainly Chinese enough to serve the empire, right? While others who were Chinese born and bred and who didn't master the written language would be much more on the outside. There's a cultural definition of self, which I think is very, very important. Again, just to give away where I will end up on this, that definition is fading fast in today's China. I wouldn't say it's totally dead, but it's almost dead. And that also creates all kinds of difficulties. Now, in order to understand this, and this is the historian, right, talking about international affairs. In order to understand this, you have to have a certain grasp of history. Because if you do not, you will end up absolutely nowhere. You will not understand the background. And what is the background, the most important background for today's China? Well, that is the Qing Empire. And most of you here will have heard about the Qing. But it's probably even more important, I mean, at least that's how it struck me when I was doing this book, than what most people have assumed, including historians of China themselves. Because the Qing is what today's China inherited. It inherited it almost physically. Think about, we don't have a map here. Think about a map of China. Most people know roughly sort of what China looks like. Now, that map of China today, with the exception of some parts up in the northeast and a very significant slice of Mongolia, that map of China is a map of the Qing Empire. So for those Chinese who are insisting that China spent 150 years in continuous decline, not bad, you know, still being stuck with the borders, roughly, of what the empire was like 250 years ago, after 150 years in decline. So there must have been something more to the Qing, right, than what most Chinese today would be willing to admit. The best way of understanding the Qing Empire is as a political project, as a modern political project, centered around a somewhat peculiar, but still to most Chinese understandable version of what Confucian rectitude actually meant. So these people, who were a mixed bunch, I mean, very often you hear the Qing represented as the Manchus. Forget that. I mean, there were some people who would be defined as Manchus among them, including the imperial family, but they were composite. They were hybrid. There were Manchus, there were Mongols, there were Koreans, there were Chinese, there were Russians, bunch of people. The Qianlong Emperor's key foreign policy advisors, one was Portuguese, the other one was from Croatia, modern-day Croatia, Dalmatia. This was an empire, I mean, as empires go, and it thinks in terms of subjects, right, in a very, very broad sense. So these people took over Beijing, made it their capital in the early 17th century, and engaged almost immediately after that on a relentless program of expansion. So anyone who looks at the Qing and think about inward-looking China, right? So by the time my story starts in 1750, anyone within this region who thought that China was inward-looking would be sent off to have their heads examined. You know, there's nothing inward-looking about the expansion that the Qing emperors, the two great Qing emperors, especially Kangxi in the 17th century and his grandson, the Qianlong emperor, in the 18th century, undertook. It was also a remarkably durable and long-lived project. So from the Western incursion started in the 1840s, and throughout all of the rest of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there's this idea that the Qing are finished. They're dead. They're yesterday's news. And every single time they were able to fight back, right? With immense brutality in confronting their enemies. For those of you who are Monty Python fans, this reminds me a little bit about from this, from the Holy Grail, where you have this knight, right, who is fighting, and then he gets his arms cut off, and then he gets his legs cut off, and he says, "Come back and fight me, you know, I will bite you." Qing was a little bit like that. They just refused to die. They just refused to give up. And that's incredibly important for the way modern China looks today, in terms of its shape, but also to some extent in terms of its content. The Qing lasted for a long time, and in terms of ideas, we can talk about this more in the discussion later, a lot of what modern China has today, it has inherited from the Qing. Much more than you find most people in today's China admitting. Another misconception to me, which I'm trying to deal with in this book, is this idea about China as being a latecomer, as being backward, as having to wait around in order to enter the modern world, the Western world. In most respects, that's simply not true. I mean, Chinese in the late 19th century, when they got the opportunity to do so, more or less embraced the kind of modernity that they could get from elsewhere, this economic and social transition that went on in the late 19th century and early 20th century. When these people got the chance to break out from one of the strongest states we have known, the Qing Empire, they set off on their own to do things they had not been able to do before, to travel, to start businesses, to take an interest in foreign religions, foreign ideas, and they do so with a vengeance. So these people, if they are not held back, they decide for themselves what they want to do. And in terms of the timing for this, so think urbanization, industrialization. This is critically important. This is sort of the great divergence 2.0, right? I think you're going to have Ken here at some point, or Ken Pomerantz, who will be talking about this. Now, okay, so around 1900, China is possibly backward if you think about a comparison with England, or a comparison with much of the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, right? Or some parts of Germany and Italy. But and of course the US Northeast. But it's not backward compared to the rest of Europe, or compared to the rest of North America or South America. And I often use as an example my own grandparents from a small village in the west coast, on the west coast of Norway, who in the early part of the 20th century came in to the nearest town, got work, entered the market economy, the money economy, started using money for the very first time, right? And sort of sold their labor in order to get the return for it. That's very similar to what happened in China roughly at the same time, right? In much bigger numbers, of course, in China. So, but it's true that a very large section of China, just like everywhere else, were not much touched by what happened in its most developed sectors in the late 19th and early 20th century. Those sectors that were, or those areas, those regions that were, started to advance very, very quickly. And this is not just true in terms of production. It's also true in terms of mindsets. This transition that you could talk about from magic to science. Just like in most parts of Europe or most parts of rural America, this happened very, very quickly. It happened within, a small part of a generation. It's just that the Chinese generally were quicker at this, were better at it than most people that I know of elsewhere. By the 1920s, a generation after science in its Western form was started to be taught at Chinese universities and colleges, China has its first Nobel Prize laureates in science, on an international scale. So this is quick, very quick. My favorite story about this is the great Chinese writer Guo Moruo, who went to school around the turn of the century. And he writes in his autobiography of one of his science teachers, one of his, I think it must have been his astronomy teacher, right? So Guo was in a school, in a high school that was divided into two parts. So it had a Chinese curriculum and it had a Western style curriculum. And in this particular astronomy case that Guo mentioned, his teacher, I'm sure tired after a long day, as teachers sometimes can be, misreads the second character of the expression Tianran Jiangxiang, so natural conditions, as Tianlong Yingxiang, the appearance of heavenly dragons. And then very quickly in his astronomy lectures, these celestial creatures start to cruise the skies back and forth until he jumps straight back into Western style astronomy and explains this in a very material fashion. That's, I think, a good impression of where China was and how quick this transition was mentally around the turn of the 20th century. So to me, and this again wouldn't surprise you based on what I said already, to me, the history of Chinese modernity in its 20th century form is the history of China's involvement with the outside world. It is about embracing change when given the opportunity to do so. And it is about creating a society that in many ways is a hybrid society. Both foreign in terms of its antecedents and Chinese. That's an essential part. I talk about it as this is perhaps what you could call the most significant position that you find in the book. Maybe not fully an interpretation, but certainly a position. That the making of modern China was a metamorphosis. That what we see today is a hybrid created from domestic and foreign influences. More so than most countries. Not less so, or roughly at the same level, but more so. So China is in its essence more international than many other countries because of this transition. Now, when I say this to my Chinese students, they almost have a heart attack. But I mean, if they don't, then there is something that we can discuss. No? Now, as all historians, of course, I also like to think, going back to my discussion with the grad students here at Berkeley over lunch, to periodization. Right? There can't be an historian worth her salt without having a grasp of periodization. And in this case, it made sense to me. I mean, it was useful in terms of trying to understand the different phases from the late 19th century and up to today. So you could talk about, with the great Hong Kong-based China historian Frank Dikötter, about what you could call China's age of openness from the 1880s and up to the 1930s or thereabouts. Now, some Chinese would of course see this as a period of devastation and decay. Think warlords, a splitting up of the state, all of that stuff. And that's true. I mean, there was a lot of internal warfare. Things were not looking good in terms of putting together a state. But at the same time, that remarkable, by Chinese standards, absence of the state gave people opportunities, as I already pointed out, that they would never have had under other circumstances, right? To do their own thing, to do what they wanted to do. In some cases, without doubt, this gave rise to blatant exploitation, both by foreigners of Chinese and more often by Chinese of other Chinese. There's no doubt about that. Seeing capitalism in its early form break through is never a pretty sight. But it did open up to a degree that would have been unprecedented earlier on, and unfortunately in China's case was also unprecedented later on to quite some extent. Because from the 1940s to the 1980s, you get what I call the Soviet era in China. And I talk about that from the 1940s, even before the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Civil War, and up to the 1980s, mainly because of where a lot of Chinese, and not just communists, got their ideas from in terms of how they wanted to change Chinese society. Towards a strong state, towards certain ideas of modernity that came out of the Soviet experience and came out of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. On lots of things from education to architecture to urban planning, very often brought to China by people who were not communists and hadn't even been to the Soviet Union, right? But very often Soviet in terms of their essence. Now, look, this is not very hard to understand, and I spent some time in other books dealing with it. And going back to what I said earlier on in this lecture, I think it should be rather self-evident. In many ways, Soviet modernity for a young Chinese born around 1890, such as Mao Zedong, for instance. Soviet modernity is a way of eating your cake and having it. You do both. You can get modernity with justice, with social justice, not the kind of dog-eat-dog kind of world, the exploitation part, the imperialist kind of capitalism. No, you could get modernity through the state, underpinned by a strong emphasis on regulation, education, and technological development, the Soviet experience. And that's the reason why I say that this lasted up to roughly into the 1980s. I mean, some of it is still left there today. Because this is not about the Sino-Soviet alliance, which died a death in the early 1960s. It's about central ideas for how to build a state and how to reorganize society. And that didn't go away in China after the political relationship between China and the Soviet Union died. When I first came to China in the late 1970s as a undergraduate student, Beida, Peking University that I was studying at, was still very much a Soviet institution, Soviet-style institution. Some people, myself included, would say that there are significant parts of that left at my Chinese alma mater even today. I'm sure we have some Beida graduates here. They will know what I'm talking about. And then from the 1980s, in another of these remarkable changes that you find on the Chinese side, you have what you could call the American era in China. And I say American more than Western or foreign for a reason. And this actually goes back to what we were discussing at lunchtime. The opening up of China, the reform and opening era, started at a point where the US form of capitalism, of the market, seemed to rule supreme, also in an international setting, in the 1980s, right? So what the Chinese embraced was first and foremost that particular, I would almost say peculiar version of capitalist modernity. And that has lasted to some extent up to today. I mean, when I'm in China today as a rather old-fashioned European, I feel entirely left behind by the relentlessness of this Chinese emphasis on sort of hyper-market solutions, on American style of marketing, American style of management. That's what matters. We can discuss later on why this became so important and why the US aspects became significant. So, in conclusion, let me do two things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation today, but before I do that, let me just mention what I see as three key moments leading up to where China is today. One very significant one, which plays a great role in the book, as you will see when you read it, is the encounter with Japan. So no other country has been more important for China's history from the late 19th century up to today than Japan. The point I make in the book is that this is a troubled relationship, but it's not a one-sided, unidimensional kind of relationship. There have been times during that long period that I cover in the book where China and Japan, where Japanese and Chinese, have been truly close to each other in many ways, not least in terms of education and the exchange of ideas and the cultural impact that is there. This is true even at times, and this is what's sometimes difficult to understand for young Chinese today, when the Chinese and the Japanese states have been in conflict with each other and sometimes even at war with each other, particularly in the mid-1890s and up to the interwar period before Japan's full-scale attack on China started in the 1930s. So even after the pretty disastrous war of 1894-95, you have lots of young Chinese saying, we have to learn from Japan. Sun Yat-sen's very last speech they gave in Beijing before he died, he exhorts young Chinese students to learn Japanese. He says, if there is one thing you can do for your country, it is to learn Japanese, so that you can pick up the ideas that has made Japan rich and strong, and to understand them, because it's better for us, better for the Chinese, that we get them from there than we get them through other kinds of sources. Deng Xiaoping, who I think the current Chinese government ought to learn more from, had this famous saying that China cannot rise against Japan. It can only rise with Japan. And I think he's absolutely right. There are difficulties today, as we know, historical questions, but also contemporary territorial conflicts that lead away from that. But the centrality of Japan is very, very clear. And it's not just pointing in the direction of conflict. So secondly, the role in more contemporary times of the Chinese diaspora, which is essential. Now, most countries have diasporas of different kinds, and many of them tend to be very important. But in China, I think it's more important than in most cases. And the reason for that is quite obvious. These people have knowledge, have capital, have incentives that could serve China fantastically well if they themselves are willing to link up with China. And that's varied. I mean, some people, I do understand them, who come from a Chinese background would say, oh, China is too much for me. You know, I have my own country now, I'm going to stay in that country and work my way up there. But there is quite a large number of Chinese who come to the opposite conclusion, not necessarily by moving to mainland China or Taiwan or any other Chinese state, but by interacting with it. And these people have had a tremendous impact on what China looks like today. The modern transformation of China from the 1980s would have been unthinkable if it were not for the Chinese diaspora. I mean, people going back and forth, being citizens in more than one country. And today, inside China, unfortunately, you often find that played down. The idea is that development came from the inside, right? And outsiders, whatever they were, only played a small part in all of this. Not only is that historically, factually wrong, it also, I think, points in the wrong direction for China in the future, how it ought to see the world. And then finally, and this will come as no surprise to you, Daniel, because you have written about this yourself, the 1970s as the great turning point for contemporary Chinese history. That when China went into the 1970s, it was a dirt poor and terrified country. Where people had really been going through hell. I mean, in terms of the various Maoist campaigns at the end of that era in China. And then how quickly this turned around when people were given an opportunity to do other kinds of things. Now, my contention in this book, and this will also be my next China-related research projects, is that most of this change came from below. And that it started well before reforms were put in place in Beijing. So over the past 2 months, I lived in China, in the south, and I've been going all over trying to talk to people and getting access to materials on that change particularly in Guangdong, Fujian provinces in the early 1970s. But we find very clear signs that this was, if you want, the market as revolution in a way from below. That people were so terrified in terms of what could happen if there was a new round of Maoist campaigns, which had seen twice people die in the streets in Guangdong province of hunger. Now, anyone who knows Guangdong province knows that that's next to impossible, right? I mean, you really have to screw up royally in order to create a situation like that. And these people were afraid that it could happen again, didn't want to go back there, and therefore they started inventing new forms of interaction, which then later on were taken up at the central level. Okay, challenges for today. I'll be brief on this, so we have some time to discuss. In international terms, one of the big challenges for China has to do with borders and neighbors. And the reason for that, first and foremost, is that China today, and in my view, tomorrow, quite some time into the future, will remain a regional power, not a global power. It will take China a very, very long time to establish itself, with the exception, of course, of aspects of international trade and international finance, as a truly global power. The capabilities are not there. And capabilities are not just thinking about material capabilities, I'm more thinking about intellectual capabilities. The Chinese have to understand the outside world much better in order to try to, if they ever going to do it, play a similar role to what the United States plays today. But for the region, the Eastern Asian region, East and Southeast Asia, and maybe further away as well, that's a different story. I think it's pretty clear that all of the last 3 sets of Chinese leaders have come to think of their country as the natural center for their region. And that is what they are trying to achieve. So far, it must be said, without great success. Certainly under the current leadership, what they managed to do is more to do what the United States did in the 19th century, which is to throw its weight around and antagonizing all of its neighbors. China has, since I think it has concluded that it really had risen after the 2008 financial crisis, that power had actually shifted, ended up in a situation which to me, and I said this in Beijing recently, is totally untenable. Not understanding that all great powers have difficulties with neighbors, but you can't have a falling out with all your neighbors at the same time. That's not good strategy, whatever way you want to define strategy. Then secondly, the emphasis on technology and trade, which I think will be with China for a very long time to come. Because China needs it. I mean, at the point when China has become the world's biggest economy, which, dependent on how you see it, would either happen very soon or very, very soon, it will still have a very large population that lives in poverty. 400 million people or thereabouts. Not a very large percentage of the Chinese population, but a lot of people, right? And China is particularly under pressure because it will be the first country, at least the first country I know of, that will be old before it's rich because of the one-child policy, the artificial demographic limitations, which in my view has been a disaster for China and has not worked in terms of what China wanted to achieve. So China needs trade, it needs foreign investment, it will continue to do so for a very, very long time. But this also makes China into something as a rising power, which China undoubtedly is, that is different from anything that we've seen before. And this is one of the central messages of this book, is that those who think of China as being different for cultural and historical and sometimes, unfortunately, for racial reasons, in terms of its behavior as a great power, are almost entirely wrong in terms of the record that we have today. Unlike the United States and unlike Great Britain when they rose to prominence, China is already integrated into the international system that it is a part of. It's more integrated into the world economy than any previous rising power has been. Think the United States, for instance, in the early part of the 20th century. Or think in terms of economic growth, think Japan and South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s. One good measure for this is foreign direct investment, FDI. So in the most advanced sectors of the Chinese economy today, those, the high-tech sectors that are oriented towards exports, about 60% of the capital comes through foreign investment. In Japan, if we take Japan in 1970 as being at a roughly similar level, the figure in Japan was about 6%. In Korea, it was even lower a decade later. So China is already connected to the international system in a way that is quite unique for a rising power of China's size. Now, is this a way of saying conflict, even war, is impossible because of the degree of interaction, of synergy that's already there? Of course not. Unfortunately, the 20th century is littered with examples of countries that are pretty well integrated and still have some kind of significant conflict with each other. But it says something about China's priorities, and that's the important thing for me with regard to this. And then finally, what I consider China's biggest problem, domestically or internationally. And that is that as a country, as a polity, it is very badly governed. China has enormous aspirations in terms of what is going to happen in the future. And it has an outdated form of government that doesn't hold up in terms of the challenges that the country is facing. Now, one has to be careful with this because clearly on some issues, including some of the growth of the economy, in terms of some aspects of planning, infrastructural changes, for instance, the government has done quite well. There's no doubt about that. But when it comes to actually delivering what an increasing number of Chinese are preoccupied with, clean government, clean environment, some kind of idea that people can actually have a say about their own daily day, this government is failing dismally. And I'm not here talking about the need to introduce democracy of a Western style now or anytime soon. I don't think it's going to happen, and I'm not even convinced it would be a good thing for China if it were to happen. But what I'm talking about is that as the economy settles into what economists now call the new normal, sort of from hypergrowth, 10% economic growth per year, down to, my guess is over the next few years, closer to 5%. It's still not bad, right? I mean, most countries would kill for 5% economic growth, right? But it does put a lot of pressure on the system when you have that kind of decline, and particularly on the working class, right? That people are able to voice their own concerns during a time like that is essential. And it's the only time I'm going to use this term, Daniel, for the presentation today. History tells us, right? But on this I will. History tells us that regimes that try to crack down on dissent to further limit the ability of people to use the public sphere as a safety valve when their own daily day is coming under pressure, those governments end up in trouble of some form, of some sort, right? So is it possible for the Chinese communist regime to rectify these difficulties? On balance, I think it is. A bit against myself, because I would like to see a much more pluralistic China than what is the case today. But I do think that even under a communist government, it will be possible to rectify some of these issues. But they have to do it, right? They have to get away from what they're doing at the moment, which is to say about political reform, just as about economic reform, we are going to do it. Oh boy, you just wait, we're going to do it. And very little happens, right? So my sense on that is that time is running out. That the current regime will come under increasing pressure if it does not become much more serious about practical hands-on reform. First and foremost, economic and structural, but also increasingly political. So that's what I wanted to convey to you today. Thank you for listening. Very much looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Arne, for a profoundly illuminating and perfectly calibrated talk.
Thank you.
We have about 25 minutes, I think, for questions. So at this point, I would like to open the floor. Because we are recording this session, I will need to pass around the microphone in order for questions to be asked. So think of this as a figurative baton as well as a literal microphone. When you speak, please speak succinctly because we don't have a great deal of time, and please also introduce yourself. With that, the floor is open.
And speak loudly because I have a clogged ear.
And the
Over-enthusiastic scuba diving, in case you wonder.
And the microphone does not amplify, it merely records.
Hi, my name's Sophie Marie Kong, and I'm studying history with Professor Sargent and at junior level. And I listened to you talk. I felt that you still use this old paradigm of analysis on China, though you trace back the history from the long back to the present time. You're still using the same Cold War attitude. Is like your book on Cold War is wonderful, but I think is the paradigm shift has occurred now, and you haven't changed that at all in terms of the lens of your use for China. For example, you said about Southeast Asia and East Asia, they are all against them. That is not fact. One thing, you don't even know the language of those countries in those parts, besides Chinese, you know. So, because most of the sources you listen to mostly from like Western or American, which is like bias. So the source is not true. For example, Thailand have security connection with China, and also Indonesia and Malaysia has they make a contract of rapid train, and Burma is changing towards China in a positive way, changing that general. Get him out. And then also in South Vietnam, we changed the one that anti-China. All of these because the lack of understanding the grand strategy of the 21st century that Japan and United States had in terms of containment on China, and that has been changing, and you haven't changed kind of in time on that.
We want to take some more questions?
Absolutely. Let's take some questions and then you could answer.
Sure. Let's take a couple more.
Leonid Kiel, Political Science. You talked about the range of needs that China manifests with regard to the international economy and its resources. But what about the opposite situation? To what extent do you think the international economy will need Chinese economy to operate functionally?
Right.
Harold Smith. I'm a resident scholar here at Cal. If you look back 250 years, I would have thought religion would have played a role. It certainly did in Western civilization. But I didn't hear much about the role of religion in making the China of today.
Right. Maybe I should I do those three,
Yes,
Daniel?
let's do those three questions and then come back for some more.
Now, on the first one, the old paradigm. So I spent a lot of time when I was in East Asia this time, traveling in Southeast Asia. And I can assure you that the vast majority of people I spoke with, all walks of life, regard China's relationship to their own countries as problematic. And the reason for that is not so much what goes on in terms of their economies. I think there is enormous potential for Southeast Asia to cooperate with China. It is mainly because of China's behavior with regard to the South China Sea question. I was twice in Hanoi talking to Vietnamese leaders and to their foreign ministry. And it's pretty clear that they are, let's put it mildly, very concerned about where China is going to go on this, to the point that they are actively trying to get the United States to play more of a role in the region. Something that I think, by the way, is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, for the region or for the United States itself, but that's a slightly different question. And I think you find this also in countries that do not have overlapping claims with China, such as Indonesia, for instance. And that's more important for China than what is happening in Burma or Malaysia or even Singapore. Indonesia is a pretty well-resourced state, also in military terms. It's a Muslim great power. And it really, I think it's certainly its current leadership, but past leadership as well, feel that China is really throwing its weight around in the South China Sea. Also rhetorically. I mean, I remember meeting with a senior Indonesian official just after the 2011 ASEAN +1 summit in Hanoi, where Yang Jiechi, the then Chinese foreign minister, had given this extraordinary briefing in which he said that what you have to understand, this is the K-der finger, right, for anyone who's been in China. What you have to understand is that there is a difference between small countries and big countries, and China is a big country. Now, for an Indonesian to hear this is troubling. It's also blatantly untrue. So this guy, who is not normally known for his temper, sort of really, hit the table and said, "We're a serious country. We insist on being treated as a serious country." So I think this is what China needs to do. I agree with you that not everything is negative with regard to Southeast Asia's relationship with China. Is the relationship rescuable? Absolutely. Though it will take time. But it is striking for me, and this is more the historian speaking, that given what Deng Xiaoping and his leadership was able to do with regard to Southeast Asia, which was almost miraculous. I mean, being able to turn around 2 generations of conflict and resentment and making it into a good collaborative relationship, a really good collaborative relationship, which he said that he was more proud of, by the way, than either normalization with the United States or the closeness to Japan. That the current guys have been able to throw that away within less than 5 years is to me, a big strategic mistake. International economy need China. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that. We all need China at the moment. We should all wish and pray for China to do well, because if it doesn't, then a lot more people than the Chinese are in trouble. I think structurally, what the issue here is that both China and the rest of the world will be served by increasing interaction. I mean, the idea that China, even when it's on its worst behavior on whatever, say South China Sea, that one can in a way contain China, think about it, this actually goes back to your question as well, in Cold War terms is entirely impossible. I mean, China is too integrated, it's too important, it's also of a very different kind. I mean, and this is particularly important to understand in this country. Since I go back a long time in my own interaction to living and working in China, China today is a much freer, richer, happier place than what it was when I first came there. Much, much more. So, we can talk about things that are wrong with China today, and there are many. But in terms of the overall sense of what kind of society, what kind of state, even what kind of regime this is, this is not the Chinese Communist Party of the past. Religion play a role. That's interesting. I spend quite a bit of time on the religion in the book. And my Chinese friends have always been questioning that. They're sort of wondering why I do this. Now, part of the reason is quite obvious, because so many of the non-Chinese who came to China in the 19th century, such as John Fryer, originally came there as missionaries, right? And that had a significant impact. I think, by the way, that religion is playing an increasing role in China today. Particularly forms of Islam and forms of Christianity. But we can talk more about that later on. But at the state level, and in terms of the development of China as an entity, religion, as many of you will know, has been remarkably absent. So the Qing emperors, for instance, are a good example of this, in interesting terms. Had no religion. They could not have a religion because they were the state. So the Qianlong emperor, poor man, not as intelligent as his great-grandfather, but someone who thought very seriously about how to rule, right? We have his diaries, which are fantastic reading. He worships at all the temples, all the churches, all the mosques. He's struggling to figure out, to separate his Mongols from his Kazakhs. And when he gets it wrong, he is really down on himself in his diaries. Oh, I messed up again. What would my revered grandfather think about me? I mixed up my Kazakhs with my whatever. And I promised never to do this again. The state could not be religious because it was imperial. Much of that inheritance from the Qing live in China today as well. With the current government also saying the state and servants of the state cannot be religious because it detracts from their role, what they really ought to do. But the reality of it, of course, is that quite a number of people are increasingly attracted by religion because it gives them something to believe in, which the current state cannot offer. One of the largest, so when I live in Beijing, I live in a guest house at Peking University. And just down the road, across the main highway from Peking University, there is a mega church that all Americans, particularly those from the western parts of the country, would immediately recognize, right? And it's extremely well attended, including by people who work for the state that really shouldn't be there. So I think this is going to be more important in the future.
We'll take another round of questions. I'm going to start at the back. Again, please introduce yourselves.
TJ Pempel, political science here at UC Berkeley. You spoke about the Deng Xiaoping comment about China cannot rise against Japan, but can rise with or should rise with Japan.
Yep.
But of course, the current relations between the two are pretty sour. And obviously, there's a big fault to be acknowledged on the Japanese side, but it does seem as if the Chinese Communist Party has officially decided more or less since Tiananmen to castigate the Japanese, both in terms of advancing the legitimacy of the party, but also in terms of its overall domestic regime stability. So can you just comment on how you see that relationship playing out at the current time?
Good, thanks.
How you doing, sir? Josh Stone, political science history major. I know we're discussing some topical issues. I'd like to give you an opportunity to maybe take a step back. Wartime China. 30 years before a group of American men arrived in Japan and elsewhere to play a little ping pong, there was a group of American diplomats called the Old China Hands, stationed in Chongqing. These men would be the first to approach or reproach the Chinese Communist Party, what was called the Dixie Mission. These men arrived in Yunnan in 1944 to meet with Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party leaders. And this would be the first time diplomatic relations would occur between the Communist Party and the United States government. Subsequently, you talked about in your book, Hurley, Ambassador Hurley, will become later Ambassador Hurley, arrives. And negotiations, of course, go south, resulting in, of course, in 1949, the People's Republic of China established. Can you talk about the significance and inform people about this period that's often overlooked?
Great.
we'll take one more question.
Yeah.
And
Let's take both of them. Yeah, you first. Yeah, please.
Okay. Bishao from the China Center Studies. I have a doubt about, you are talking about the continuity between current China and Qing. Because historians argue that the current China, the PRC, actually is a betrayal against Qing as a multiple religious and linguistic and ethnic empire. So I have a doubt on that. Could you explain more?
So could you repeat that? That the current regime is a kind of betrayal of the
Of
Qing
the
heritage?
Empire Qing, especially at the
Okay.
Kangxi era.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And the second question is that you talk about China-centered kind of approach. Actually, historians arguing about to take the Eurasia as a holistic continent. So if you take that into consideration, will your conclusion and periodization be changed to some kind of extent? Thanks.
Yeah.
Let's take your question too.
Hi, so my name is Preston Chow. I'm a political economy major. So my question is, well, not really a question specifically, but earlier during your talk, you spoke about the Chinese preoccupation with like a natural order of things. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on your views on how that preoccupation materialized during the Soviet and U.S. eras and the difference between them.
Okay, let's do those. Japan. That's big. That's a big question. What has created the current predicament? I think, in its main form, it's of pretty recent creation. I think it has a lot to do with the current regime thinking that China has already risen, that China has risen while Japan is in decline, and that it's therefore possible to achieve things such as predominance in the Eastern Sea. That Deng Xiaoping, who was a much more sensible figure and a much smarter figure, concluded would take 100 years for China to achieve. Overreach, that's what parts of this is about. But there is, of course, also what is happening in Japan at the same time that one needs to take into consideration, which is a Japanese reassertion of its statehood, of its independence, and sometimes in the more uglier forms of Japanese nationalism. There's no doubt about that, even though it pales in comparison still, or yet, to the kind of nationalism that you sometimes find in China. So look, this one is difficult. When I teach this in Beijing, very different from when I started teaching this there 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Young people will say, we cannot have a normal relationship with these people because of what they did to us during the war, and they haven't apologized. Well, I mean, if you, as a great power, make your foreign policy towards your most important regional partner dependent on what happened 50, 60 years in the past, what I like to say to them is that then Richard Nixon couldn't have gone to China because of the Boxer Rebellion. It's not, I mean, it's neither here nor there. It's also particularly problematic because when I first came to China, I knew I lived with people who had really suffered during the Japanese occupation. And they had a reasonably normal relationship with Japan and Japanese. These young people who have no relationship of that sort whatsoever now believe that they have to stand up for China's rights historically. I think it's problematic. Can it be overcome? Again, I think it is possible, but I think then both sides have to work very hard at it. From an American point of view, of course, some of this is not entirely unwelcome. As long as China and Japan are at odds, who will be the predominant power in Eastern Asia? The United States of America. Some Chinese are smart enough to realize that that's the case, but a relatively small number, I'm afraid, so far. Wartime China and the Nixon mission. So this is very close to what I did my first book on. And if you should summarize, since we're now getting on in terms of time, the conclusion of that book in 4 words, it would be lost chance, no chance. I don't think there was a lost chance for the United States in China. I don't think there was any opportunity at that point in time for the Chinese communist leadership, either before they got into power or after, to ditch its alliance with the Soviet Union and move closer to the United States of America. Almost whatever the United States had done, even if they had immediately recognized the PRC, which I think was highly unlikely at that point, I don't think that would have played much of a role. And the reason for that is, of course, that the Chinese leadership, what they wanted to do was to be close to the Soviet Union. I mean, it was their raison d'être. It was why they were there, was to build the Soviet Union in China. Now, could a better relationship have been possible? Yeah, I think it could have been possible, which would have been important and could have led us to avoid at least some of the excesses of the Korean War. But the idea of the new People's Republic of China turning around and sort of starting working with the United States, I just cannot see. Even though I'm, much pressed by my Harvard colleagues, Fred Lugwell and Graham Ellison and others, to think about, and Neil Ferguson, not least, to think about counterfactual history. I won't do it, not for this one. CCP as betrayal of the Qing heritage. Yeah, I think there is a point in that. Now, this is difficult because sometimes, and I'm myself guilty of this, because of the weight of the Chinese state, right? What Benjamin Schwartz used to point out, this extraordinary weight of the state and the significance of the state. We sometimes go too far on that. We take it too seriously, and we think that what is happening is a product of some kind of state initiatives. I think the real betrayal of the Qing heritage is, of course, Chinese nationalism. Right? And that doesn't just come from the government, although the government tries to manipulate it. It also, to a very high extent, comes from below, which is what is problematic. So I think, that's an interesting way of thinking. I think it goes to the core of the question, which is a really difficult question. What is China today? And some people would say that China today is an empire that tries to behave as if it were a nation state. That's not going to work, or at least it's not going to work anytime soon, because there are still very strong groups of people within China who would define themselves as not part of that particular nationalist project. And I'm not just thinking Tibetans and non-Chinese Muslims, but I'm thinking about a lot of other people as well that have different kinds of identities that do not quite sit well with that particular nationalist initiative. What the Qing did well was to avoid that. They were remarkably multi-dimensional, and as they were multicultural, of course, in terms of their approach. Now, sometimes that led to trouble, because what that meant was that the central aspect of the power was political and military. And that if you wanted to keep your head in place, you better conform to that. And the expansion into Central Asia is, of course, a key element in it. So that's what's so interesting. I start my book in the 1750s for that reason. This is when the Qianlong Emperor, after a lot of discussion, back and forth on it, decide that the Qing need to regulate, need to invade in order to regulate the core areas of Central Asia. And he held back a long time from doing that because they were not able to convince him that that was part of the natural order of things or China's mission. But in the end, a little bit like other empires, there's both the push and the pull. There is the need to set things in order. Very often, what really created Xinjiang means new border in Chinese, that really created it was, of course, the need always to civilize barbarians that were just a little bit ahead, of the Qing troops. What we call that mission creep, we call that today, right? And of course, it ended terribly. I mean, it ended in genocide because some of the Western Mongol groups were too strong to control without a significant decimation of their numbers. So that's where my story starts. It starts with this, I mean, in my view, terrible and tragic and counterproductive decision to kill off the main tribes among the Western Mongols. Which brings me to this issue of the natural order of things. And now it becomes really difficult, right? The whole concept of natural order in Chinese philosophy is connected to the Neo-Confucian tradition. There are many, as you know, many contending traditions that would not emphasize it, at least not to the same extent. It's not emphasized in the same way, certainly, and not to the same extent, by Master Kong himself, by Confucius. I think it is an outgrowth of the very peculiar international system, now I get a chance to go back to that existed during the Song era in China, where China, for the only time in its history, had what you could call a natural other, the Liao regime on its northern border, which was almost a kind of mirror image. Now, it was not fully Chinese, but it wasn't fully foreign either. And it was very, very Confucian, right? So what the Neo-Confucians had to do was, in order to defend that position, if this brings echoes of current US politics, they are entirely intentional, of reifying the Chinese position in the world by creating a distinct hierarchy that was cultural and that put China, meaning Song, at the peak. There's only one peak, right? There can't be two peaks. So in other words, the Liao, for all their efforts, were necessarily barbarians. Even if the Song paid tribute to them, which they did during some periods of time, even if they were becoming more powerful than what the Song was, there was still this absolute insistence that the peak of achievement was the Song and could not be otherwise. That is in state and international terms, the natural order link. Now, unfortunately, both in Chinese, or neither in Chinese or in English or any other language that I know of, do we have good studies of this. And that would be, for those of you who read and work in Chinese and want to work on history, I think the Song order, the 11th, 12th, early 13th century order, would be something well worth of study because it has all these fascinating parallels. I often use it as a parallel to the Cold War international order as well, actually, which may or may not be right, but it does it for me.
The natural order of things seems like an apt note on which to conclude this part of our conversation. And I know some of you still have questions that you would like to put to Professor Westad, and I'd like to invite you to pose those questions over a glass of wine, as we will have a short reception to conclude this. But first, please join me in thanking Professor Westad for a most compelling presentation.